Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Think about the feeling you get when you scroll through your news feed on any given Tuesday morning.
Oh, that immediate knot in your stomach.
Right. You see footage of global summits, massive military exercises on disputed borders, and talking heads debating the absolute collapse of societal order.
It is a lot to take in.
It is. There is this visceral, physical sensation of anxiety that starts in your chest. I mean, it feels like the entire globe is caught in this frantic, chaotic frenzy, and everyone is shouting at the top of their lungs trying to grab the steering wheel of history.
Yeah, that is a great way to put it.
You get the distinct impression that human beings, particularly those with a lot of authority, are desperately trying to orchestrate an escape from any kind of higher accountability.
That anxiety is a very natural human reaction to observing massive geopolitical or cultural shifts. I mean, when you are standing on the ground watching the dust get kicked up by the marching of armies or the shifting of cultural tides, your horizon is entirely dominated by the noise.
You lose the big picture.
You really do. You lose any sense of a broader horizon. You are caught in the immediate terror of the moment.
And that ground level terror is, it's our starting point today. So for this deep dive, we're looking at John Calvin's classic commentary on Psalm 2.
A fantastic text.
We're looking at a text that details the unstoppable sovereignty of God's appointed king amidst a massive global rebellion. It addresses that specific modern anxiety we just talked about, but it was written centuries ago about an ancient text.
Yeah, the premise of the commentary is that the world seems to be in absolute chaos, but it invites us to fundamentally shift our vantage point.
So let's jump into the very first verses.
Yeah.
Why are the nations so furious, and what are they actually trying to achieve?
Well, the commentary opens by analyzing the immediate historical situation. So Psalm 2 paints a picture of a world in absolute upheaval. Nations and leaders are not just disagreeing, they are actively conspiring.
Right.
To understand the gravity of this, we need to look at the author of the psalm, King David, and the reality he was living in. He was facing a vast multitude of enemies.
Yeah, let's unpack that historical context first, because it sets the stage for everything else. When we hear the word tumultuous, we might just think of a rowdy protest.
A riot or something.
But David was dealing with an existential threat to his life and his throne from day one. I mean, he was anointed by the prophet Samuel when he was just a shepherd boy, a nobody.
Yeah.
And from that moment on, his life was marked by people trying to kill him or depose him.
Yes, the historical reality was incredibly violent and unstable. First, you had the domestic enemies. The house of Saul, the previous king, waged a long, bitter civil war against David.
That lasted for years.
It did. And even after David was established, he faced rebellions from within his own family, like the devastating uprising led by his son Absalom. The hearts of the men of Israel were literally stolen away from him. He had to flee his own capital city weeping.
And if the internal strife wasn't enough, he had the foreign threats right on his doorstep.
Spot on. The surrounding nations, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, they all saw this new king as a threat.
They didn't want him there.
Not at all. As soon as David settled the internal disturbances, the neighboring states became hostile. They formed coalitions. They were confederated.
So it was organized.
Very organized. The text uses words like assembled together. This was a coordinated international effort to violently remove him from the throne he had just secured.
I mean, if I am David and I am looking at this massive multinational coalition breathing down my neck, and then I look at my own kingdom, which keeps fracturing into civil war, I would be terrified.
Oh, absolutely.
If I judge this situation according to basic military strategy and human reason, I have every reason to be full of apprehension. I would probably assume I made a mistake and should just go back to watching sheep.
Any rational person would think that. Calvin acknowledges that David had an incredibly sore battle to fight. But the analytical pivot here is how David frames this conflict in his own mind.
How so?
He does not view this as a standard political dispute over border territories or trade routes. He recognizes a fundamental truth about his kingship. He did not seize the throne out of ambition.
Right, he wasn't a political opportunist.
Far from it. He did not have a depraved desire to overthrow the government. He was perfectly content in the pastures. He only followed the call of God.
Okay, that makes sense.
He knew with absolute certainty that he was made king by divine appointment. Therefore, his logical conclusion is that the attack is not really against him. By attacking the king God appointed, they are assailing God himself.
Let me make sure I follow the logic here. Because the Creator built the throne and placed the king on it, anyone trying to tear down that specific throne is declaring war on the builder.
That is the core argument. But to understand the commentary fully, we have to grasp a massive theological principle that governs how Calvin reads the Old Testament.
Let's hear it.
David's physical kingdom, his literal throne in Jerusalem, was a type or a shadow.
Okay, I need to pause right there. Those are heavy theological terms. Type and shadow. Break that down for me. If someone is listening to this while commuting, how do they visualize a historical kingdom being a shadow?
Sure, think of it like an architectural blueprint versus the actual building. A blueprint is a real tangible thing. You can roll it out on a table, look at the lines, and understand the dimensions of a house.
Right, it has real value.
It does. But nobody tries to live inside a blueprint. It exists to point forward to the physical structure that will eventually be constructed.
I see where you're going with this.
In Reformed theology, David's temporal kingdom was the blueprint. It was an earnest, a tangible, historical down payment given to the ancient Israelites to assure them of the eternal spiritual kingdom that would eventually be established in the person of Christ.
So David was made king not just for the sake of ancient Israel's political stability, but to act as a living, breathing prophecy of the Redeemer.
Precisely. Calvin makes a forceful argument that we must hold this principle. The things David declares concerning his own struggles and his own throne are truly predicted concerning Christ.
It is all connected.
It is. It would be absurd to stare at the blueprint and ignore the massive skyscraper being built right next to it. The apostles themselves understood this method of reading the Psalms.
Yeah, they quoted it a lot.
They did. In the book of Acts, when the early Christian church faced violent persecution from the religious and political leaders of their day, they did not pray for a better political strategy. They quoted Psalm 2.
I know.
They recognized that the entire world, both Roman Gentiles and religious Jews, had entered into a common conspiracy to destroy Christ, just as the ancient nations raged against David.
Yeah, that reframes the entire discussion. The conspiracies against the Shepherd King were a micro-level foreshadowing of the macro-level cosmic conspiracy against the Son of God.
Spot on.
When these earthly leaders gather their armies and hold their summits to overthrow this divinely appointed authority, they are participating in a rebellion that stretches back to the beginning of time.
That is the reality.
They hold their little conferences, they draft their declarations of independence from the Creator, and they march out with absolute confidence.
And their confidence is staggering. The text quotes the rebels saying, "Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us."
That is bold language.
It reveals the psychological state of the rebellion. They view submission to God's appointed king not as a source of peace, but as a slavish, shameful yoke.
Let's talk about those bands and cords. In a modern context, we see this attitude everywhere. The idea of submitting to an external moral authority, especially a divine one, is viewed as the ultimate oppression.
Oh, without a doubt.
Our culture prizes absolute autonomy. We want to define our own truth, our own morality, our own existence. Any law that says you must do this or you must not do that is treated like a chain that needs to be broken so human beings can achieve their full potential.
That is a very accurate read of the human condition. The ungodly perceive the rule of Christ as a degrading subjection. They feel restricted.
I want to be free.
But Calvin points out a fascinating contradiction in their rebellion. The enemies resolutely deny having any intention of attacking God.
Wait, if they are saying, let us break their bands, how can they deny they are fighting God? Are they totally ignorant of who they are opposing?
They do not openly avow themselves as rebels against heaven. Very few people wake up in the morning and say, I am going to wage war against the creator of the universe today.
Right, that sounds like a cartoon villain.
Exactly. Instead, they cover their rebellion under various pretexts. They might claim they are fighting for freedom, for progress, for human rights, or for national security.
Using good words to cover bad actions.
Yes. Calvin even notes that they often presumptuously boast of having God on their side. They convince themselves that their actions are righteous and justified.
That is terrifying. They're completely self-deceived. They view themselves as the heroes, fighting against an oppressive system, completely blind to the fact that the system they are trying to dismantle is the very order established by the Creator.
They are blind to it. But Calvin argues that their verbal professions do not matter. The sum of their consultation, the actual result of their actions, is the attempted overthrow of the kingdom God set up.
The actions speak louder than the slogans.
Way louder. Because they seek to undermine that specific kingdom, they blindly and ferociously wage war against heaven. He makes a logical progression here.
Okay, let's hear the logic.
If resisting ordinary earthly authorities is a form of rebellion against the order God permits, How much more severe is the rebellion against the sacred spiritual kingdom established by his special privilege?
Oh, that is a heavy thought.
Since God chose to rule humanity by the hand of his own Son, refusing to obey Christ is a direct denial of the authority of God.
You cannot bypass the king to get to the emperor. There is an inseparable connection. He that honors not the Son honors not the Father.
That is the biblical standard.
The Father will not be worshipped except in the person of the Son. So no matter how a culture tries to spin it, no matter what noble-sounding language they use to justify throwing off Christian morality or the authority of Scripture, it is an act of war against heaven.
That is the sober reality the text presents. But knowing this reality is meant to lead to immense comfort for the listener.
Comfort. How so?
Calvin outlines two specific consolations to draw from this passage when we are faced with a world that seems to be tearing itself apart in its hatred for divine authority.
I think anyone paying attention to the world right now needs some consolation. What is the first one?
The first comfort is understanding that the chaos is actually a fulfillment of prophecy. When we see the world raging to disturb the prosperity of Christ's kingdom, we should not be greatly disquieted by the upheavals.
Okay.
Calvin points out that it is not at all unusual for the world to begin to rage as soon as a throne is erected for Christ.
Let me push back on that slightly. If Christ brings a kingdom of peace, why does his arrival cause so much chaos? Shouldn't a message of salvation calm the waters?
In theory, yes, the kingdom of Christ is inherently peaceable. But because of the malice and pride of human nature, that peaceable kingdom never rises into open view without exciting massive disturbances.
Because people hate giving up control.
Yeah, human pride violently resists being humbled. So the resistance is not a flaw in the kingdom. It is a reaction of the disease to the cure.
That is a great analogy.
Therefore, when you see the chaos, you are actually seeing the script being followed perfectly. The rebellion was predicted. It means God is not caught off guard.
That changes the angle entirely. The chaos on the ground is actually proof of the design. It's like seeing the storm clouds gather exactly when the meteorologist said they would.
That is right.
You might not like the rain, but you are comforted by the fact that the system is understood and predicted. So, what is the second consolation?
The second consolation relies on the identity of the one being attacked. When the ungodly muster their forces, relying on their vast numbers, their infinite riches, their cultural influence, and their military might, we may safely laugh them to scorn.
Laugh at them. Why?
Because the one they are assailing is the God who is in heaven. When we see the church or the truth of Christ seemingly overwhelmed by the strength of its enemies, we must remember who the enemies are actually fighting.
It's not a fair fight.
Not at all. Their attempts, no matter how sophisticated or powerful they seem, will come to absolutely nothing.
If the earth is raging in a frenzy, and down here it looks terrifying, it forces us to ask, well, what is the reaction from heaven?
That is the big question.
If I am an earthly monarch and I receive intelligence that a massive multinational army is amassing on my border with the express intent of destroying me, my reaction is immediate panic.
Naturally.
I am drafting soldiers, I am rationing food, I am building walls, I am sending frantic diplomatic cables. How does the Creator react to this global conspiracy?
This contrast is the most stunning part of the text. David places the frantic preparation, the secret counsels, the swelling pride, and the vast resources of his enemies on one side of the scale.
And on the other side?
On the other side, he places the authority of God alone. And the text says, "He who sits in the heavens will laugh at them. The Lord will have them in derision."
I want to spend some time on that word, laughs. It is such a specific, almost shocking detail. We often attribute emotions to the divine. We talk about divine wrath, divine love, divine jealousy. But laughter.
It does seem unusual.
A laughing God in the face of human rebellion feels almost dismissive. If I am a Christian suffering under a tyrannical government, a God who sits back and laughs doesn't immediately sound comforting. Why does Calvin say the text attributes laughter to the Creator?
Calvin provides two incredibly deep theological reasons for this laughter. First, the laughter teaches us about the disparity of strength. God does not stand in need of massive armies to repress the rebellion of wicked men.
He doesn't need to draft troops.
No, he does not view this global conspiracy as an arduous or difficult military campaign. By giving God the lofty title, "He who sits in the heavens," David is stressing that God's authority remains completely intact and unimpaired, regardless of what men attempt on earth.
The phrase "sits in the heavens" is a posture of total repose. He is not pacing the floors of heaven, he is seated.
Exactly. Let the kings exalt themselves as high as they want, they shall never reach heaven. While they think they possess the might to confound heaven and earth together, Calvin writes that to God they resemble so many grasshoppers.
Grasshoppers, wow.
Dealing with this rebellion is effortless for him. He could crush it with the most perfect ease as often as he pleases. The laughter is the natural reaction of infinite strength observing finite arrogance.
A grasshopper jumping in the dirt, threatening to pull down the sun. That puts it into perspective. The highest, most terrifying earthly authority with a dictator with nuclear launch codes, the cultural icon with millions of followers from the vantage point of heaven, is an insect.
It is a humbling thought.
But you mentioned a second reason for the laughter, and you said it addresses the suffering aspect.
Yes, the second reason for the laughter helps us understand divine timing, which is crucial for those who are suffering.
Okay, break that down.
When God permits the reign of his Son to be troubled, he does not cease from interfering because he is busy elsewhere, or because he is unable to afford assistance, or because he is neglectful. He purposely delays the inflictions of his wrath to the proper time.
So the delay is a strategy.
It is a deliberate choice. He waits until he has exposed their infatuated rage to general derision. Calvin points out that God does not connive at the wickedness of his enemies out of indolence.
He isn't just ignoring them.
No, he confronts their insolence with quiet contempt for a season. He allows them to overextend themselves, to boast, to lay out all their plans so that when their defeat comes, it is absolute and undeniable.
This reminds me of a chess grandmaster playing against a boastful novice. The novice is moving pieces aggressively, talking trash across the table, fully convinced they have the grandmaster on the ropes.
Yeah, that is a perfect picture.
The grandmaster sees the board clearly. He could end the game in 3 moves. But instead, he just leans back and watches. He lets the novice overextend. He lets them expose all their weaknesses. He lets them think they're winning for 10 more moves.
Just letting them dig their own grave?
Yeah. He delays the victory to make the novice's eventual defeat not just a loss, but a total humiliating display of their own foolishness. He exposes their strategy to general derision before ending it with a single, sudden checkmate.
That analogy captures the essence of Calvin's point beautifully. If God does not immediately stretch forth his hand against the ungodly, it is his time of laughter. And Calvin offers a pastoral word here.
What is it?
Although we might weep in the meantime, seeing the trouble around us, we must assuage the bitterness of our grief with this reflection. God is simply waiting for the fit time to exercise judgment, because the text then introduces a sharp pivot.
The tone shifts.
It does. By using the adverb then, it points to a sudden change in course. The laughter stops. Verse 5 says, "Then will he speak to them in his wrath and vex them in his sore displeasure."
Speak to them in his wrath. Let's analyze that phrase. When I hear speak, I assume verbal communication. Is God sending a prophet to give these kings a final verbal warning? Is he issuing a vocal decree from the clouds?
No, and this is an amazing insight from the commentary. This speech is not for the purpose of instructing his enemies. The term speak here means a manifestation of God's wrath, which the ungodly do not perceive until they actually feel it.
So it's not words.
God speaks through actions in history.
Action is speech.
Yes. Think back to David's enemies. They thought it would be the easiest thing in the world to destroy a young man who came from a mean shepherd's cot. They thought the prophecy and the anointing of Samuel were ridiculous, empty pretenses.
Just a silly ritual.
Right. But when God finally overthrew their armies and settled David firmly on the throne of Mount Zion, he spoke. He didn't speak with his tongue, he spoke with his hand. He spoke by altering the political reality of the ancient Near East.
He makes himself perfectly understood without uttering a single syllable. The event itself is the vocabulary.
Calvin writes that whenever God defends the kingdom of his Son by the tokens and inflictions of his wrath, although he does not speak a single word, he speaks loudly enough to make himself understood.
You can't miss the message.
The wicked may conduct themselves as wickedly as they please, ignoring every written warning, but they shall at length feel what it is to make war against heaven. The action of God establishing his king is the ultimate, undeniable statement.
So if heaven's response to this massive political anxiety is essentially to ignore the armies, laugh at the arrogance, and then establish a king through decisive action, it forces us to ask a question of legitimacy. What gives this specific king the right to rule? Why should the earthly authorities care? We look to verse 7, where the king himself steps forward and announces, "I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee."
The decree is the foundational proof of a lawful calling. Let's look at it from David's perspective first. David published this decree to take away all pretense of ignorance from his enemies.
To make it public.
Yeah, he wanted to prove publicly that he did not usurp the throne through a military coup. He brought with him the explicit command of God. He had the receipts, so to speak. But for Christ, this decree is fulfilled in an infinitely greater way.
How so?
Christ proved himself to be endued with lawful authority from God the Father, not only by the miracles he performed, but by the ongoing preaching of the gospel.
Let me stop you there, because that connection is fascinating. The decree of the Son's authority is declared through the preaching of the gospel. You are suggesting that when a pastor or a teacher stands up and preaches from the Bible, that act of speaking is the ongoing declaration of this divine decree.
It is more than just a historical recitation. Calvin makes a point here that elevates the act of preaching to a staggering height. The apostles first, and after them, pastors and teachers, bear testimony that Christ was made king by God the Father.
Okay.
But because these human ministers act as ambassadors in Christ's stead, Christ rightly claims to himself whatever is done by them.
So the authority of the message isn't based on the eloquence or the holiness of the guy in the pulpit.
Not at all. The authority of the gospel is established because, although it is published by human beings with all their flaws and limitations, it does not cease to be the gospel of Christ.
That is a crucial distinction.
Calvin argues that as often as we hear the gospel preached by men, we ought to consider that it is not so much the men who speak as Christ himself who speaks by them. It is a singular advantage that Christ lovingly allures us to himself by his own voice through this earthly preaching.
That drastically changes how a person should listen to a sermon. You aren't just critiquing a lecture on ancient Near Eastern literature. You are hearing the voice of the king declaring his own decree over your life.
That is exactly the point.
But I want to dig into a theological debate hidden in this verse. The king announces, "Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee." If we are applying this to Christ, we run into a chronological issue.
Yes, we do.
In Orthodox Christian theology, Christ is the eternal Son of God. He existed before time began. He was not created. So how can the Father say, "This day have I begotten thee"? This day implies a specific moment in time. Begotten sounds like a starting point. This sounds like he had a birthday.
You have just touched on one of the most critical theological debates of the early church, and Calvin uses his commentary to provide a very sharp clarification. This phrase has been historically misunderstood to talk about the eternal origins of the Son.
Right, which leads to a lot of confusion.
But Calvin argues that "this day have I begotten thee" does not mean Christ began to be the Son of God on that specific Tuesday. It is not about his origins or his eternal generation within the Trinity.
If it is not about his creation, what is it about?
It refers to human understanding and knowledge. It denotes the time of manifestation.
Manifestation. Okay, explain the difference between creation and manifestation.
Think about an undercover king. He is the true king, born to the royal family, possessing all the rights and authority of the throne. But for a time, he dresses as a commoner. He walks among the people, and nobody knows who he is.
He blends right in.
He is still the king, but his identity is hidden. Then, one day, he steps into the public square, takes off the disguise, puts on the royal robes, and the royal heralds blow the trumpets, declaring his identity to the city.
Oh, I see.
That day is the day of his manifestation. He didn't become king that day. His kingship was simply made obvious to everyone else.
That makes perfect sense. So when the choice of David to be king was clearly manifested to the people of Israel after years of hiding in caves, he came forth as one lately begotten of God, since such immense honor could not belong to a private person. The public anointing was the day of manifestation.
And the exact same logic applies to Christ. Calvin notes that Christ had been hidden from the beginning in the sacred bosom of the Father. His full glory was obscured under the types and shadows of the Old Testament law.
Even during his life on earth, really.
Yeah, even during his earthly ministry, his majesty was largely veiled in human weakness. But the phrase "to be begotten" signifies that he came forth with authentic and evident marks of divine sonship. And Calvin specifically ties this day to a historical event.
Which event?
The day of his resurrection.
The resurrection is the day the disguise comes off completely.
Yes. The Apostle Paul does the same thing in the book of Romans, saying Christ was declared to be the Son of God with might by the resurrection from the dead. The resurrection was the day his glorious identity was declared with undeniable force to the world.
It left no room for doubt.
It was the solemn and proper time of his manifestation. The decree was permanently ratified in an empty tomb.
So, with the king's identity officially manifested to the globe through the resurrection, the next logical step in the commentary is to examine the sheer size and scope of his territory.
Let's look at that.
We look at verses 8 and 9, where the Father tells the Son, "Ask of me, and I will give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel."
The sheer, staggering scope of this promise proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that we are looking past David to Christ. If you compare David's historical kingdom with other great empires of antiquity, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Romans, David's territory was confined within very narrow boundaries.
It was a pretty small strip of land.
Yes, he had tributary nations, and he expanded the borders of Israel, but it was a geographically limited space in the Middle East.
It certainly wasn't the uttermost parts of the earth.
Right. But Christ's dominion embraces all lands and all nations. The Father promises to deny nothing to his Son relating to the extension of his kingdom. The calling of the Gentiles, meaning the inclusion of non-Jewish nations into the covenant, is explicitly foretold here.
So it's a global vision.
Calvin points this out to prevent anyone from imagining that the Redeemer was appointed to be the king of only one specific ethnic group or one geographic location. His inheritance is global.
But let's look at the actual state of the world right now. It doesn't look like a unified global kingdom submitting to Christ. It looks fractured. It looks secular.
It definitely looks messy.
The church itself often looks divided, diminished, and pushed to the margins of culture. How does Calvin address the gap between this massive promise of global dominion and the messy reality of history?
Calvin is very realistic about this tension. He acknowledges that we might look around and see the kingdom seemingly divided, diminished, and broken down due to the wickedness of men.
It feels like it's losing ground sometimes.
The sheer ingratitude and rebellion of humanity constantly hinder the visible prosperity of the kingdom. It often looks like a ruin. But Calvin argues that this visual brokenness does not render the Father's prediction ineffective.
But the promise is still active, even if the progress looks invisible.
The progress is highly active. Christ is continually collecting the dispersed remnants of his people from all quarters of the globe. Even in the midst of wretched cultural desolation, he keeps his people joined together by the sacred, invisible bond of faith.
That is a comforting thought.
So that not just one corner of the globe, but the whole world is progressively subjected to his authority. The gathering is happening, even if it doesn't make the evening news.
This introduces another massive tension in the text, though. We are talking about collecting people, gathering sheep into a fold. We usually associate the Redeemer with meekness, mercy, and gentleness. We think of the loving shepherd carrying the lamb on his shoulders.
You're right, the classic image.
Yet here, in verse 9, he is described as rigorous, austere, and carrying an iron rod to dash enemies in pieces like a potter's vessel. That is incredibly violent imagery. How do we reconcile the gentle shepherd who heals the brokenhearted with the severe judge wielding an iron mace to shatter nations?
It appears to be a stark contradiction at first glance. How can the one who is sent to cheer the poor with tidings of salvation, to heal the sick, and to bring the sorrowful into the light of life also be armed with an iron scepter designed to destroy?
It's hard to hold both those ideas in your head at once.
Calvin synthesizes this tension beautifully by explaining the dual nature of his rule. First, the severe sovereignty is set before us to strike alarm into his enemies. And if you think about it, this is entirely consistent with how a truly loving shepherd must operate.
Explain that. How is an iron rod an instrument of a shepherd?
A shepherd who tenderly cherishes his gentle sheep must treat the wild beasts with a severe degree of force. You cannot protect a vulnerable flock without being willing to fiercely drive away or destroy the wolves.
Oh, wow. I see.
If a shepherd is gentle to the wolf, he hates the sheep. So Christ assumes a severe character to beat down the obduracy of those who provoke his wrath and threaten his people.
That makes a profound practical sense. I mean, to be truly gentle to the vulnerable, you must be formidable against the predator. You have to be capable of violence to protect the peaceful. But what exactly is this iron scepter? Is Calvin suggesting the church should take up literal swords and spears to conquer nations?
No, and this is where Calvin's interpretation becomes so dense with theological meaning. He is vehemently against the idea of advancing the kingdom through physical warfare. The iron scepter is not a literal weapon of metal.
What is it then?
It is the breath of his mouth. It is the doctrine of the gospel itself.
The gospel is the iron rod. The message of grace and repentance is the thing shattering nations.
Yes. Calvin notes that Christ does not need a sword or a spear to conquer. He smites the ungodly by the breath of his mouth alone. The ministers of Christ are furnished with spiritual weapons to cast down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God.
That is a brilliant concept. Let's think about the physics of that analogy. You take an iron rod and you strike a clay pot, a potter's vessel.
It shatters.
The earthly kings, the arrogant cultures, the nations raging in rebellion, they seem harder than stone in their obstinacy. They build massive monuments to themselves. They control the global economy. They seem permanent and invincible.
They look untouchable.
But when they are struck by the truth of the gospel, when they collide with the reality of divine justice and grace, they are exposed as incredibly fragile. They shatter like cheap pottery. The iron rod of truth breaks the clay vessel of human pride.
They are more fragile than earthen vessels. The psalmist exposes their foolish pride by showing that they will be broken in pieces by various methods till they become his footstool.
So their pride is just an illusion.
Yeah. Human empires rise and fall, shattered by the march of time and the providence of God, but the word of the Lord remains. However, Calvin highlights another layer to this iron rod that is incredibly convicting. It doesn't just apply to the wicked nations.
Wait, there's more.
This iron rod is also used to train disciples to repentance.
Wait, so the iron rod is used on the sheep too. The shepherd hits the sheep with the iron mace.
In a spiritual sense, yes. Calvin argues that the faithful themselves must be humbled in the dust before Christ stretches forth his hand to save them. We all have pride.
We sure do.
We all have clay vessels of self-righteousness that need to be broken. The iron rod of the law and the gospel breaks our natural pride. But Christ trains his disciples in such a way as not to appear terrible to them. By showing them his shepherd's rod, he quickly turns their sorrow into joy.
He breaks our self-reliance so that he can heal us. He shatters our illusion that we can save ourselves so that we will rest under the shadow of his hand.
Spot on. When the text speaks of bruising and dashing to pieces as a final destructive act, that ultimate destruction only applies to the rebellious and the unbelieving who refuse to submit out of repentance and are eventually overwhelmed with despair.
But for the believer.
For the believer, the breaking is redemptive.
So if the king wields an instrument capable of shattering the pride of nations, and the gospel is this unstoppable force that exposes the fragility of human empires, the earthly rulers introduced at the beginning of the text desperately need a warning.
They really do.
They are standing on the tracks, the freight train is coming, and they need someone to blow the horn before they are destroyed. And that is exactly what we see as the text pivots to verses 10 and 11. And now, O ye kings, be wise, and ye judges of the earth be instructed. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling.
The deep dive moves here from description to explicit exhortation. David, acting as a prophet and a teacher, addresses the kings and rulers directly by name. And Calvin asks a good question.
What's that?
Why single out the kings? Why not just say, listen, all you people? Because kings and judges are the ones who are least likely to listen. They are not very easily brought to a submissive state of mind.
Because they are used to giving the orders, not receiving them.
Right. Rulers are often puffed up with a foolish conceit of their own wisdom. By trusting their elevated station, their wealth, and their sycophants, they flatter themselves into thinking they are loosed from the laws which bind the rest of mankind.
The rules don't apply to them.
Their pride greatly blinds them, making them think it is beneath them to submit even to God. They feel untouchable.
We see that constantly throughout human history, and we see it today. People acquire a little bit of authority, a little bit of wealth, or a little bit of fame, and suddenly they feel exempt from the ordinary rules of morality.
It is a universal human flaw.
They insulate themselves. So David issues a command, be wise. But what is the text's definition of true wisdom here? Because an earthly king usually thinks he is the wisest person in the room by default.
The text's definition of true wisdom is the exact opposite of the world's definition. The world thinks wisdom is the ability to outmaneuver your opponents, to accumulate influence, to secure your own legacy.
Being shrewd.
Yeah. But Calvin notes that the beginning of true wisdom is when a man lays aside his pride and submits himself to the authority of Christ. No matter how good an opinion the princes of the world may have of their own political shrewdness, Calvin bluntly states they are errant fools until they become humble scholars at the feet of Christ.
To be wise is to be humble. To recognize your actual position in the universe as a created being, not the creator, until you realize you are a grasshopper, you are an absolute fool.
That is the essence of it.
But then we hit another phrase in verse 11 that creates a massive emotional tension. The text commands them to rejoice with trembling. Can you unpack the psychology of that? How can those two distinct emotions coexist? Rejoicing feels light, free, and happy. Trembling feels fearful, restrictive, and anxious.
It is a brilliant psychological insight, and Calvin contrasts it with the way the wicked experience life. The ungodly sport. With their own destruction through vain pleasures, they enjoy an unbridled insolence.
Just living for the moment.
They are intoxicated with the gratification of their lusts, imagining themselves happy while they are actually making themselves enemies of God. Their joy is careless, it is oblivious. But true gladness, the kind of joy that actually lasts and sustains a soul, requires an immense reverence.
So it is not a flippant, carefree joy. It isn't the joy of a party.
Right. There is a massive difference between the cheerful state of a peaceful conscience that knows it enjoys God's favor and the reckless abandon of the proud. The cheerful state of a peaceful conscience never loses its awe of the Creator. It is a joyful submission.
It's balance.
The fear prevents the joy from devolving into wantonness and arrogance, and the joy prevents the fear from turning into paralyzing terror. You are resting securely in His favor, which brings deep joy, but you are acutely aware of His infinite majesty and justice, which brings a holy trembling.
I think of it like the joy of being near a massive, roaring bonfire on a freezing winter night. You are out in the cold, you are freezing to death, and you find this huge fire.
Oh, that's good.
You are so intensely glad for the warmth. It is saving your life, and you rejoice in it, you spread your hands out to it, but you also tremble, because you know the sheer intensity and force of that fire could consume you in seconds if you disrespect it.
You don't mess around with it.
You don't play carelessly in the flames. You don't treat it like a toy. You rejoice in the heat, but with a healthy, respectful trembling for the nature of the fire.
That is a superb illustration of the concept. The warmth is grace, the heat is holiness. You must respect both. And understanding this awe, this careful balance of joy and reverence, leads directly to the final, incredibly urgent command given to every single person listening.
The climax of the psalm.
We reach the climax in verse 12. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish from the way when his wrath is kindled in a moment. O blessed are all who put their trust in him.
Let's start with the physical action commanded here. Kiss the Son. That might sound unusual or overly intimate to modern Western ears. We shake hands or we salute. What is the cultural weight of this command?
In the ancient Near East, kissing was a solemn token of honor yielded by subjects to their sovereigns. It was a physical act of showing absolute allegiance, fealty, and submission.
Like kissing a ring.
You would kiss the king's hand or his signet ring. Since it is the declared will of the Father to reign over the earth by the hand of his Son, the proper proof of our obedience to God is to reverently embrace Christ. Calvin makes a stark, uncompromising point here.
Which is?
If God is not honored in Christ, God is defrauded of his honor.
You cannot claim to revere the Creator while despising or ignoring the specific king he appointed to rule you. It is a package deal.
Exactly. But there is a severe warning attached to this command. The text warns of the anger of the Son.
And I am struck by the terrifying suddenness of the wrath described in this verse. It says, when his wrath is kindled in a moment, and it warns that they will perish from the way. I want to look closely at that preposition. It doesn't say they will perish at the end of the road after they have lived a full life and accomplished all their goals. It says they will perish from the way, right in the middle of it.
That is a very astute observation of the text, and Calvin zeroes in on that phrasing. He points out a common psychological trap. The despisers of God are accustomed to flattering themselves during times of prosperity.
When things are easy.
When things are going well, when the economy is strong, when they have their health, when their political influence is secure, they run to great excess. They live life exactly how they want, ignoring any divine laws. And because the judgment of God does not fall on them, immediately remember the laughter and the delayed timing we discussed earlier, they think they're completely safe.
They mistake God's patience for God's approval. They think, well, I haven't been struck by lightning yet, so I must be doing fine.
That is the delusion.
They reckon themselves at a great distance from their end. They tell themselves they are just in the middle of their race. They have plenty of time to figure out the spiritual stuff later, maybe when they are old and retired.
That is the exact deception. They say to themselves, peace and safety. But the prophet threatens that they will be cut off by a sudden destruction. When his wrath is kindled, even in a moment, they perish from the way.
Just cut short.
They do not get to finish their grand architectural plans. They do not get to write the final chapter of their memoirs. They are stopped abruptly mid-stride. Calvin warns that it is a fatal mistake to abuse the patience of God by growing more presumptuous. The wicked deceive themselves with the false hope of a lengthened delay, only to be swept away in an instant.
So we have this culminating picture of sudden, fiery wrath. We have a king who shatters massive nations with an iron rod, who cuts off the proud and the arrogant right in the middle of their path. If the psalm stopped right there, it would leave a person feeling overwhelmed with absolute
It
terror.
would be devastating.
It would feel like standing in front of a firing squad. But the text doesn't end on the note of wrath. The very final sentence changes the emotional tone of the entire piece completely. "Oh, blessed are all who put their trust in him."
Calvin calls this concluding sentence a sanctuary of hope, and he argues that it is absolutely necessary for the text to end this way.
Why is that?
Because the earlier descriptions of the iron rod, the dashing of pottery, and the sudden kindled wrath could strike terror into anyone without distinction. The psalmist knows that even faithful, humble believers might read about this severe judgment, apply it to themselves due to their own awareness of sin, and be crushed by the weight of it.
The sheep might get terrified by the rod meant for the wolves.
Exactly. So the author intentionally opens a refuge. He shows that the sweetness of his grace is fully available to all who flee to him. After summoning the ungodly to the awful judgment seat, which is a terrible prospect for mortal men, the text immediately provides the comfort.
It gives them a way out.
It encourages faithful and devout servants to entertain good hope. And notice the pronoun. The text says, put their trust in him. That refers to Christ.
That is the core paradox of the text. The very same king who will break the rebellious with an iron rod is the exact same king who provides a blessed, impenetrable sanctuary for all who put their trust in him.
What is a stunning contrast.
It is like the eye of a hurricane. Outside the wall of the eye, there are 150-mile-per-hour winds tearing houses apart. But if you step into the center, the air is still, the sky is clear, and you are completely safe, even while the storm rages around you.
It is a dynamic shift in posture. To the rebellious, to the proud who refuse to bow, he is an immovable wall of justice that will shatter them. To the humble, who recognize their poverty of spirit and kiss the sun in submission, he is an impenetrable fortress of grace.
The entire commentary systematically strips away every single illusion of human autonomy.
It really does. It starts by showing the absolute futility of human rebellion, all the shouting, the summits, the plotting. It moves to the effortless, quiet sovereignty of heaven, laughing at the arrogance of dust.
Yeah.
It establishes the unquestionable historical credentials of the king manifested in the resurrection. It displays the unstoppable force of his word, the gospel, breaking human pride like clay. And finally, it offers a clear binary choice to every single person.
Continue in foolish rebellion and be shattered in the middle of your path, or submit with joyful trembling and find true sanctuary.
The logic of Calvin's reading is airtight. It addresses the political realities of the world, the hidden psychological motivations of the rebels who think they are fighting for freedom, and the theological certainty of God's redemptive plan.
We have covered massive theological and historical ground in this deep dive. Let's do a quick recap to pull the threads together before we close.
That sounds like a good idea.
We started down in the dirt, looking at the futile conspiracies of David's enemies, realizing they were just a blueprint for the world's hatred of Christ. We saw how the enemies of God cover their rebellion with noble-sounding pretext, but are ultimately fighting a losing battle against the Creator. Then we shifted our view upward, witnessing the majestic, confident laughter of a God who doesn't panic, but acts decisively in history to establish his king. We examined the decree of the Son, whose identity was declared to the world at the resurrection, and whose preached gospel acts as a shattering iron scepter against human self-righteousness.
The iron rod.
And finally, we heard the call to true wisdom, the command to abandon our pride, to kiss the Son in reverent submission, and to find a sanctuary of hope in the midst of global chaos.
It is a comprehensive worldview in 12 short verses.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on as you go about your week. We spent a lot of time today talking about macro-level events. We talked about kings, judges, nations, and massive cultural shifts throwing off the bonds of God.
The big picture.
Right. It is very easy to point the finger out there at the politicians or the cultural elite. But consider the borders of your own life. Where are the places in your own daily routine, your ambitions, your finances, or your private thoughts, where you are secretly holding your own little summits?
Oh, that is a piercing question.
Where are you attempting to cast off the cords of the king to maintain your own autonomy? Because if the iron scepter of the gospel is designed to shatter the pride of massive empires, it will certainly shatter our own personal internal illusions of control.
No one is exempt from that.
Rebellion isn't just happening in the capitals of the world. The instinct to rebel is in our own chests.
That is the quiet, terrifying truth we all have to confront. The demand to kiss the sun is deeply personal before it is ever political.
Let that question do its work. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Psalm 2. We hope it clarified the text, challenged your perspective on the world, and offered you a solid sanctuary of hope. We will catch you on the next one.